Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 10. It's about media and politics. It's Lesson 9 about press evolution. In this lesson, you'll learn about the patriotic press, the partisan press, the objective press, and the politicized press. This lesson is built around the idea that the general approach of the mass media has changed over the course of our country's history. We're going to look at 4 specific eras of the media in which its views, or I should say the way it does its business, has evolved. We'll begin by talking about the patriotic press. The patriotic press is a term used to describe what the press was like during the founding era of the United States of America, approximately from 1770 to 1820. During that time period, newspapers were openly supporting the idea of independence and then championing this new country that had been founded. They did this because they flourished by doing so. In other words, this helped them sell newspapers by supporting the American Revolution. And so that's basically what all the papers did that did well economically during this time period. That era of patriotic press then gave way to what we call the era of partisan press. The partisan press era was from 1820 to the 1890s. Now, what changed was that early in the history of the United States of America, the country was fairly united politically. This can be seen in the election of George Washington as President of the United States, who was unanimously elected on 2 occasions. But as he left office, he warned the people about the divisiveness that could come from the formation of political parties. Well, despite his warning, political parties did form, and the very division that he was afraid of occurred. And during the time period that then followed, this era of the partisan press, the political parties were specific backers of various newspapers. Now remember that technology had not developed enough during this time period to have things like radio and television. So newspapers were the mass media outlet of the time. And so the political parties would found their own newspapers or support their own newspapers, in some way control and influence newspapers to get their message out to the people. Even today, if you look around newspapers in many small towns in America, and even some decent-sized cities, you'll find traces of this partisan era in the names of the newspapers. Here are listed on this slide 6 newspapers that are currently still in circulation in the United States of America. Now you can see that in the top left-hand corner that a major newspaper in Tallahassee, Florida, the state capital, is called the Democrat. You can see that the big newspaper in Arizona is called the Republic. Now down bottom right-hand corner is one of the most significant of these newspapers named after a political party, and that's the Springfield Republican from Springfield, Massachusetts. It was influential in the founding of the Republican Party that eventually came into being during the era of Abraham Lincoln. So these are examples where we can still see today the partisan roots of newspapers that still exist. So during this partisan press era, the newspapers were essentially organs of the political parties, getting out the message of that political party. They didn't even pretend to be neutral or unbiased in any way. Instead, they were getting out their side of the story. So partisan newspapers were originally sponsored by the political parties, and they existed to promote the political party's point of view. So notice in these first 2 eras, we had an era in which the newspapers were blatantly in support of a particular point of view, that of being patriotic supporters of the American Revolution. Then during this partisan era, they divided up. Some newspapers supported one political party, other newspapers supported the other, but they were still being open about their biases and not really claiming to be neutral about what they were reporting. But that was about to change. We then enter the era of the objective press. The objective press era lasted from about 1890 to 1990. Now, that end period of 1990 is just sort of a rough idea for you. Now, notice that I'm using sort of clear decade distinctions here. Don't think that there was some giant dividing line in 1890 between the partisan press and the objective press. The reason we put that year down is because this is the time period when the press began to change its attitude, not necessarily that everybody had changed. And I'm doing the same by listing 1990 as sort of the end of this era. This era is exemplified by the three big television networks that came to be prominent in the United States shortly after television became a widespread technology: ABC, CBS, and NBC. These were networks that will continue to this day to be broadcast. You can throw up an antenna at your house and get these networks, unlike the multitude of cable channels that also exist today. When these networks came into being and began broadcasting, they were essentially the only TV stations for people to get out there. Now, there were some exceptions, some locally broadcast ones, but basically around the country, you turn on your television, these are the stations that you would get to tune into. Now, this additional technology that I'm showing here with these TV stations is a good way to understand what the objective press was doing and why. But I want you to realize that these things I'm going to be telling you about as I describe the objective press were true of other forms of media too, like the newspapers. They transitioned from being partisan to being objective during this time period. And here's the reasons why. As the country became more urbanized, in other words, as people came to live more and more in big cities, and as the country became more industrialized with factories and the progress in the material standing of people, in other words, they started to have cars and refrigerators and things like that, the news outlets, such as newspapers, entered an era of greater competition with each other in smaller areas for more people, and that led them to become consolidated. So in a big city where you may have had a bunch of smaller towns, each with their own local newspaper, who then essentially grew into a big city as the big cities grew, you could end up in the end with only one or two big newspapers covering the big city. Now, this then caused them to do something, and that can be described as moderation. So think about it. If you're a small town newspaper focusing on the audience in your particular area that may have certain views in common, and then you have another small town newspaper nearby focusing on the views of people in that community, once those communities all grow into one big city, now there's the potential for one newspaper to be distributed to all these places and make money from all of them, now that they've all become one big community. But there's a diversity of views there, a diversity of ideas. And so the newspaper, to capture a bigger audience, to get more of these diverse people to buy the newspaper, might try to moderate itself. It might try to become neutral and objective. In other words, say, oh, no, we aren't biased. We don't have an opinion. We're just giving you the straight news. So you can buy our newspaper, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether you're a liberal or a conservative. Everybody can come buy it. So this era of the objective press is characterized by these media outlets, whether it be newspapers or television, claiming to be nonpartisan. In other words, not for one political party or the other, and claiming to be objective. That way they don't offend customers. So this is particularly, it can be seen in those three big television networks that I talked about a moment ago. Basically, you had these three big companies that dominated television across the United States of America in the early days. It was expensive for them to get their product out to customers because they had to build big antennas spread all over the country to convey their message to more and more areas. And so that's why you ended up with only a few companies, because they had to be the biggest and most powerful to afford to be in business. But because they were the biggest and most powerful and spread all over the country, they were trying to appeal to everyone in the country. And so they would claim to be nonpartisan, in other words, not for one party or the other, and claim to be objective. We're just giving you the neutral facts, not our biases. I keep saying claimed because critics of them would say, of course they had their biases. Of course they weren't really objective. Of course, they may have favored one political party or another. But even if they did those things, they tried to hide it at the very least. And maybe, in fact, tried to really be neutral and objective. But they were definitely not partisan anymore. They were trying to create an image that they were neutral. This was made particularly possible for newspapers because of things like the Associated Press coming into being. The Associated Press was an organization that allows newspapers to trade stories. It's still in existence today. It sort of spreads out the work. One newspaper might cover a particular story that's interesting to others. Through the Associated Press, it can distribute it to other newspapers in the country and get some money kicked back to it, and vice versa. Well, all that story trading means that the newspapers across the country will basically be all containing the same stories. Again, it creates a moderating effect on everything. Rather than newspapers trying to appeal to their one little area and their one little area's biases, they're trying to present a sort of neutral line for the whole country. Well, as newspapers shared stories, some of them ended up being more powerful than others. They were the ones that had the means to produce the most stories that then were shared with others. So the rest of the newspapers looked to them for guidance of what would be important, what they should be reporting about, what should they be paying attention to for their readers. And other media paid attention to them too. Both radio and television were influenced by these big newspapers to follow their lead. So in a sense, the entire country was getting the same news, presented the same way. This is the hallmark of the objective era of the press. But that changed with the coming of what we call the politicized press of today. The era of the politicized press is from 1990 to the present. And here I'm symbolizing it by this image here of somebody sitting there with dozens, perhaps hundreds of different television stations to choose from. So another way we could think of this politicized press era is as a diversified press era. Now, why do these two things go together? Why is it that a diversified press is also a politicized press? Well, to understand that, first maybe I need to clarify what I mean by a politicized press. Essentially, we're saying that the media has gone back to its previous partisan positions. Now, they may not be as overt about it as they were at one time, where they would actually put Democrat or Republican in their names. But in a sense, they have begun to choose sides again politically, like they did before. And not only is that made possible by a diversified press, they're almost pressured into doing it by the diversified press of today. Let me explain why. As new technologies came along, such as cable television, satellite television, the internet, this led to the creation of lots and lots and lots of different kind of media outlets. Where back decades ago, you would have only had 3 television stations, maybe 4 or 5 if you had some independent stations around, that kind of thing. Only a small handful of television stations to choose from, and therefore they were all showing about the same thing. Now you may have hundreds of television channels to choose from. And with hundreds of television channels to choose from, they can all specialize. So you have a television station that's all sports, another one that's all weather, another one that's all news. This is called niche marketing. Each of them is deciding on their own little area they're going to try to appeal to. Well, when you have niche marketing, you can also have overtly biased media. In other words, since they're not trying to appeal to everyone, trying to stay neutral to gain as many people as possible, they can focus on one little audience and say, we're going to get all the conservatives to come watch us, or all the liberals to come watch us, or whatever it may be. An example of that is what's happened in talk radio in the last few decades. Talk radio has become dominated by conservative political commentators. The most prominent of those is a guy named Rush Limbaugh, who gets paid a massive amount of money for his for his radio program. The next most popular is a guy named Sean Hannity. The next most popular is a guy named Glenn Beck. They all have a generally conservative point of view. And they can get away with that because radio has just become a small part of a vast array of potential media sources. So what they do is they say, okay, who's most likely to have their radio on during the day, just turned on listening to it? Well, maybe older people or self-employed people or people working in a factory that can just have it turned on while they're working, things like that, sort of middle class people, whether blue collar or white collar. Those middle class sort of people tend to be conservative, tend to be Republican, and so talk radio, where people, the hosts of the radio program spend all day interviewing and talking to guests about politics, have gravitated to become conservative, to appeal to that niche audience that they're reaching. Another example of this can be found in cable television news. There are 3 big cable television networks that broadcast news essentially 24 hours a day. The first of these was CNN, which came into being back in the 1980s. Then Fox News and MSNBC came along. Now, because of this diversification, again, like with talk radio, like with news, there's an opportunity to try to capture a certain part of the market. Well, CNN was perceived as to being generally liberal. Some people called it the Clinton News Network because they thought it was sticking up for Bill Clinton, the President of the United States in the 1990s. So the founders of Fox News said, you know what, we're going to try to capture a different part of the audience. We're going to create a television station, news station, that's friendly to conservative points of view. And it's been wildly successful. Here I picked just a random week, looked up the cable television ratings for a random week, and this is what I found to be the average number of viewers for each of these channels. You can see that Fox News by itself had more viewers than CNN and MSNBC combined. This has become pretty standard for over a decade, that Fox News dominates and beats these other cable channels. By serving conservatives, giving them their niche out there where they could come to, Fox News has gotten really good cable ratings. But it's also contributed to the politicization of media, not just cable television, but across the media, as other outlets have looked at the success of Fox News and said, wow, you know, everyone just kind of knows they're the conservative network and they do really well. So maybe if we're overt with our biases too, if we just let people know what our point of view is, maybe with people, those with our point of view also will tune us in, and that will help our ratings. An example of this is the Fox News competitor MSNBC, which has become overtly liberal in its point of view to counteract Fox. So through moves like this, the creation of Fox News, MSNBC becoming blatantly liberal to challenge Fox News, that kind of thing, this idea of just being open and biased open with their biases is spread through much of the media, to the point that even if they aren't coming right out and saying what they're doing, the public seems to have noticed that they have become more and more biased. The public perceives the press as being very politicized. Here's just a couple of survey results from 2016. 74% of Americans believe that the media is biased. In other words, the objective media doesn't exist anymore as far as they're concerned. And 76% of those people believe that the media wanted Hillary Clinton to win the 2016 presidential election, and were sort of actively trying to help her have that happen. So you can see that the public has sensed this politicization of the media, and they believe that it is happening. And some members of the media even seem to admit to it. Here's an amazing quote from a CBS News president while attending a fundraiser for a Democratic presidential candidate. He came right out and said, "Journalism has changed. Partisanship is very much a part of journalism now. In other words, the era of an objective media is passing." All right, let's review what we learned in this lesson. When was the patriotic press era? Was it from the 1770s to the 1820s? Was it from the 1820s to 1890s? Was it from the 1890s to the 1990s? Or from the 1990s to the present? It was from the 1770s to the 1820s. It was around the founding time of the United States of America, when newspapers found they'd make the most money by supporting the American Revolution. What was the partisan press? Was it that papers covered different events? Was it papers supported particular political parties? Was it conservative talk radio? Or was it the press lying about their biases? The partisan press referred to newspapers supporting particular political parties. What does the objective press claim? Do they claim that they focus on certain subjects? Do they claim that they favor some candidates? Do they claim that they cover all big stories? Or do they claim that they are not biased? The objective press would claim that they are not biased. What is the politicized press? Does the politicized press cover politics? Do they say they are not partisan? Were they founded by particular political parties? Or are they politically biased? The politicized press is politically biased, whether they want to admit it or not. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 10. It'll be Lesson 10 about press attitudes.